Good evening, Internet.
Howdy doodly do.
Howdy doodly doo, said the man from the distant chamber, all covered in the stones of the names that I forget what they're called. They're called cinder blocks, that's what they're called. And that is how we are starting tonight, on this episode of Behind the Curve. I'm Andrew.
And I'm Matthew.
And we are ready to do some things in dealing with a topic near and dear to some of you, perhaps all of you, maybe even a majority of you, quite possibly a plurality. And that is...
We don't discriminate around here.
That is science fiction. Silence fiction. Science fiction. Science fiction. Silence fiction is my favorite kind of fiction, you know? It's just entirely mute. It's written by mutes for mutes.
I think this is something more dear to my heart because it was my idea for starters. And for another thing, I think it's just me because I'm more of a classical mind, because I'm all about learning and thinking and education. It's much more of a, 18th century Enlightenment thing than we were more like Romanticism. It's just like science and stuff. I don't know.
Wait, what?
Because you tend to be more romanticist, and I'm more like Enlightenment area because it's like science and learning and stuff.
I prefer the Romantic era because it is the movement against the Enlightenment, but there's no reason why we cannot dialogue about science fiction.
I'm just saying it's more of my thing, I think.
Yeah, maybe. Alright, so why don't you lead us in?
Oh, well, I wrote down reasons I think sci-fi works as a genre. This really isn't hardcore genre theory, just like really my thoughts. And I try to connect into J.J. Keeley, what he does. I think the first thing we should talk about is just how it inspired the future or predicted it. Because think of Star Trek technology, that's a really big thing. Like, not things that haven't come true yet, like faster than light, teleportation. I think just despite if that's going to happen or not, like a lot of things like we kind of take for granted. Like another thing is like multi-ethnic crew that was featured on there. Video cam communication, what we're doing now. At the same time, I feel like people tried to get like defictionalized Star Trek, but also I think that people it gave people new ideas in the first place. There's also novels that I think really miraculously predicted the future and maybe didn't inspire things, but there's this book that I read because of J.J. Keeley called The Machine Stops, written in 1909, and it featured video phones, the internet, wireless communication, underground cities. It was written around the time. This was written in 1909, so.
Okay.
It's another book I like. It's called Snow Crash, which predicted the internet really as we know it today, and as well as Google Earth, even though they didn't call it that, as well as AI you can talk to. And well, it's not really an original thing, but it was very prescient, and I think it does well as a social commentary too that really nails it head on Western post-Cold War society, and I think it would make a great movie too, kind of Gilliam-esque and ridiculous and cartoony, but I still think it works. In the movie, basically in the novel, the government collapses and basically anarcho-capitalism takes over, and basically the world become ridiculousness of American consumer culture come the norm. You had to get one of the opening chapters deals with the main character loading a pizza, has to give it to one person on the other side of the coast from Los Angeles to somewhere in the Midwest, and if they don't get it in the 20 minutes, basically they'll go insane because American society is so psychologically weak, and they have to go into therapy. It's actually a really hilarious novel. It's really can be crude and sexual, but outside of that, I think it was great. And in the book, another thing is that they build highways to Hawaii from Los Angeles, and cars going 1,000 miles per hour, and can
I'm not sure that's possible.
Hook a skateboard to it, so it's very what we would actually call dial-up punk, actually, because but it's also a social satire. It's very. I think you would like it, Andrew.
Noted. So
It's 1992 meets 2042 in the best possible way.
1992 meets 2025. I'd be happy for it to be 1992 meets 2018. All right. So, as for my view as to why science fiction works, I think because it's the left brain's conception of fantasy.
That's a good point.
It,
I mean, it's really fun because like it can be escapist, but like even if it's pseudo intellectual, I think it like tries to use the right terms, like quantum mechanics.
sometimes.
Yeah, like the word quantum mechanics get throws around. Like even at the very basic correctness of it, you basically are smarter than your ancestors when you use a term and you understand sort of like the surface level what that is.
That's not necessarily true, because I think a lot of science fiction gets away with using science as magic. And even I think with some of the more popular, some of the more respected titles, this still holds true, because we eventually had to accept that human logic cannot explain all things.
But I meant more like in a less philosophical way, how like the weeping angel are said to be quantum locked, and that they don't move unless you look at them. It's kind of a perfect illustration how quantum mechanics tells us that when we're not looking at an object, it essentially doesn't exist, and when we look at it, it basically locks into place. So I thought that was a good allegory of how things work, not so much how things actually worked. And I think it made for an interesting Doctor Who episode. So that's what I meant.
That's fair, though. I mean, I'm not the math person.
I'm not either. I just know how that concept kind of works from actually listening to an Einstein audiobook.
So then, building off of why does science fiction work, what are some things that make science fiction come up short for you?
I think like for some of the reasons sometimes like it doesn't work. Like one of the things that Keeley praised Snow Crash for, that it like like here's a part of Snow Crash that like really spoke to me. There's actually a part like again like because the world is like anarcho-capitalist and it's like kind of living in ruins of the United States government collapsing. They had this part, I forget like the exact part, but there's like a part of I think it was like in California that was like abandoned, and they said that there was like a teenage ritual of like proving that you're like a man or whatever by like going through that in a car with like your lights on. And I'm thinking to myself, okay, this is what Stephenson did. He built a world. He built a futuristic world. He built a world futuristic concept. Then he remembered to inhabit real characters in that. We'll do something like that, which it kind of belongs to more of like a world like American Graffiti of like teenagers in cars, saying ultimately, even though our technology will change, we won't change either. That was like one of my favorite moments. It's a total throwaway moment, but like it's like they can't connect people with it in a fantastical setting, which is why I usually like fantasy or sci-fi that sticks with human characters, because it's very hard to write a truly alien character. I mean, I think that Lagoon did very well in Left Hand of Darkness, which I loaned you out with, but that's why I usually think it falls short, for the same reason fantasy falls short.
Interesting. My objection to science fiction is sort of the fact that I've never really experienced one that has spoken to me in the same way that a work of fantasy has. Because I think science fiction is inherently humanist, whereas fantasy is almost always inherently supernatural.
Yeah, I think so, but it doesn't have to be that way. But
true, and I would also say
Star Wars isn't. But like, what do I?
Well, Star Wars is not science fiction. Star Wars is science fantasy, really. And it's space fantasy is what it really is. It's space wizards, magical Asian space wizards.
Played by white dudes.
Yes, as you do. But
Dune, I think, came close, though.
Perhaps.
You know, you were part of Dune. What?
Perhaps. But the way I'm thinking about it is that science fiction is sort of the extent of the human, of the materialistic to the fantastical, whereas fantasy is the natural outworking of the fantastic.
Yeah, I think like so. I think this goes back to the systematizer emphasizer thing that a lot of people who go into fantasy are kind of more the emphasizer thing side of human nature that they're trying to touch the human soul. Like with sci-fi, that's not so much there. They just want to explore concepts and things rather than people.
That is true. I think science fiction is a lot more conceptual. Also, science fiction is inherently progressive, while fantasy is inherently conservative. Not necessarily. I'm
That's
not
why
talking
China.
politically. I'm not talking politically. I'm talking conceptually,
Yeah, but
because
some would argue that like it kind of is intertwined. Like China Meeville, that's one of his criticisms of Tolkien, that his sort of stodgy British attitude kind of
it's a stupid criticism
leaked out.
it's a stupid criticism because once you try to escape one, because you can't escape the roots of what you make. And science fiction is something that really arose, from the Enlightenment. If you take Johannes Kepler's Voyage to the Moon as sort of the first of the science fiction novels, and working with
Well,
it's
remember
much more of a
China
product
Meeville.
of the Enlightenment rather than fantasy, which is a product of Romanticism, which is the movement against the Enlightenment, as I said at the beginning of this piece. So one is an inherently conservative movement. Fantasy is part of Romanticism, which was a conservative, essentially movement. I'm not saying politically again. I'm saying conceptually, because it's trying to reclaim a
Well,
lost legacy, as trying to bring out something that has been forsaken, whereas science fiction tends to be more optimistic about what can be gained. It's what has been lost versus what can be gained.
well, remember China Meeville writes fantasy too, and he doesn't think so much. He thinks that the fact that what you say, what is lost, what's been gained. Tolkien wrote that some of his books were like a reaction against, say, the suburbanization of England for Silmarillion, not so much Lord of the Rings. So this is where
I think somebody's reading a little too much into the Lord of the Rings at that point.
Well, this is the point where I'm going to say, since this is also not the top of the episode, just read. I know that you tend not to actually read Keeley and Meeville's arguments because you're a busy person, and so am I. But this is where I just say read Meeville's arguments about Tolkien, as well as Moorcock's arguments against Tolkien, and take it out of the horse's mouth, because I'm doing a terrible job trying to sum up their arguments, but it has to do with the fact that Middleton said that his political and his fantasy kind of intermingled. I didn't see his Victorian stodginess into it when he should have. He was smacking himself in the face. At least it was to Meeville. But moving on, that's basically what he said. But I'd rather you read it yourself before talking about it.
Okay, so moving along, but I do like science fiction because I believe it is fascinating, and as a writer, I like it because it does let you be conceptual. It lets you envision reality, which lets you try. The one thing it does is it does force you to come up with reasons for the bizarre. Is you actually do need to. I think this is something that it does have over fantasy, is that it requires, I think, more of its writers' knowledge.
It also seems that people, like in general, who are it's more likely they'll be inspired by sci-fi than fantasy to engineer up a new invention than rather than something they read in fantasy. It's just like how engineers think.
Possibly in an engineering way, but I think that fantasy has traditionally had a much broader scope and impact on literature because it is more related to the literary. I think. How do I put this well? I think it's easier to write a bad fantasy book than it is to write a bad science fiction book. But I think there are more.
Easier fantasy or sci-fi?
But
easier to write a bad fantasy.
It's easier to write a bad fantasy book because it's so much more accessible. But it's also, I think there's also a greater proliferation of quality fantasy works than there are of science fiction. Because if you look for like great science fiction literature, you have so much fewer options than in, I think, the realm of fantasy. When you're talking about, and even some of them overlap. So, I think if you look at sort of the intellectual stewardship of the, I think this intellectual stewardship of fantasy, I think, is greater than that of science fiction. But moving along, what I know we had specific things we want to talk about, and I know you particularly wanted to talk about Interstellar, as why you think it makes an excellent case for science fiction.
Yeah, that's probably my favorite one so far. I guess we should get a plot rundown. I'm not going to say that it does what fantasy can do, but because it's not supposed to. I think it meets the Keeling criteria of, well, at least philosophical explanation. I don't know about psychological realism. I don't think that the characters were necessarily realistically reacting as people would in real life, but I think it explored philosophy. I think it well, the interesting thing about it is, and this is in no particular order, I just think what makes it great. It predicted things about black holes by, excuse me, as you know, you might know that a lot of the things in Interstellar are practical effects, like the old 20th century sci-fi movies.
Okay.
This was actually two exceptions. The neutrons, I think, maybe the neutron star, Pentacle, and Gargantua, the black hole, and the wormhole over Saturn.
Okay.
So, but the funny thing was that it actually predicted things about black holes because the model they used for it was actually so accurate that they actually had scientists come in and actually learn new things about it. That's how well done it was. I don't know if you knew that or not.
I didn't really know that, no.
Okay, yeah. And interestingly enough, black holes were predicted possibly helped with the LIGO experiment, which confirmed black holes were a thing at all, really. And it, you know about that, right? It mapped gravitational waves and it by two black holes colliding. And
yeah, I've heard of it. I mean, I'm not familiar with it. It's been a long time since I covered it. I'm pretty sure it was 9th grade when I learned about that. So,
well, there you go. But because of that, I think it helped explore ideas of relativity, the theory of everything, meaning the quantum microscopic world and the macroscopic relative world, and real world astrophysics, through a story, like the characters were affected by the things that happened to them. It's basically Interstellar. The funny thing is about genre in movies that I think just because the way movies are so expensive and been dominated by Hollywood, fairly or unfairly, a lot of the genres are dumbed down, and they're not going for an art house. I wouldn't necessarily call Interstellar an art house film, but it was not a space opera. You couldn't just conveniently go to a planet and have nothing happen to you. This is probably maybe the first movie to really treat space as a place, even though I think it's ultimately about a family drama about a father and a daughter, which is yet another reason why I think this works. That you have the emphasizer crowd will watch it for, the father-daughter interaction and how emotionally brilliant this movie is, because it was actually going to be directed by Steven Spielberg. I don't know if you knew that.
I did.
Oh, okay.
I did actually. I believe you actually told me that.
Yeah, but also it appeals to the systematizer crowd with all its science and its jargon and its engineering concepts and all the really interesting things in that.
Jargon's in the classical pen through the paper plate analogy for black holes.
Yeah, for the dumber people in the audience.
No. It's not even the dumber people. It's the only explanation that we ever use in pop culture, because it's the only one that makes any kind of sense. And even if I remember correctly, from around the time of the movie, that it doesn't even make sense then.
Well, I have enough physics and engineering friends to say that basically is the only thing that you basically can do. But moving on, which would really take a whole episode, and I guess we can do without interviewing those people on a red film. But anyway,
I don't like interviews. I'm sorry. As a reporter for a couple different papers. I don't like interviews; they're annoying.
Fine, then I'll do it, honey. No. Anyway, but I think it's really another like big triumph of it that it ended up not being really a genre film as much as a science exploration film. Because if you were to ask me what the best fantasy novel of all time was, and this is just an example from another genre, I'd say Titus Grown, like hands down. But if you ask me what the best fantasy movie was, I'd be like, I don't know, Spirited Away, I guess, and it's not really deep. Well, I guess it kind of is in a certain way, but it's not maybe.
Spirited Away could definitely make a run for being deep. I think most of the Miyazaki films can make a case for being deep. I still question the motivations of My Neighbor Totoro, because I'm sorry, I still don't get that movie. I watch it. I mean, it's beautiful. It's visually beautiful, but I don't know. I'm just still not getting that. Like, I get why people like it, but I think it's kind of a little bit overrated culturally.
That's true. I mean, with Spirited Away, but my point is that like it's kind of funny like how the movies have a lot of catching up to do with their literary counterparts, and I think like Interstellar like took a major blow. I mean, if you look at some of the copycat movies that came out, like the dumb movie about the virus on the ISS, like at least they were like trying with that. They were at least trying to make it like believable. And I think they obviously tried in Interstellar. Let's like say that they were not trying to cut corners. I mean, there's some artistic license, but
well, of course, it's storytelling. You need, even when telling a nonfiction story, you need to take some artistic license.
Yeah, which is why I think it can't really be compared to 2001, which is my last point, because 2001 was trying to be an art film. It kind of was revolutionary because it did have certain realistic concepts, like the feat of artificial gravity, even though I feel like at the end of the day, someone like Kubrick does kind of care more how things look than what things are.
True, but I think that 2001 is such an aesthetic success, though, because everything is aesthetically part of the world. It's funny because it's kind of...
It doesn't shy away from being fictional.
Right.
That's how I would put it.
Even in the 60s, that's kind of how we still think space ought to look.
That's true.
It's funny how that hasn't like super changed.
I look at the ISS. It looks like a Kinects thing in space, not really like a Star Wars thing, really.
Yeah, it's like no matter what we do, space always looks like 80s decor. Or is it just me?
If you mean like metallic and ugly, then yes.
I mean like IKEA with panoramic windows.
Oh, well, you mean in movies or what?
Yeah, in movies.
Well, yeah, that tends to be the thing. I mean, look at Blade Runner. We call that VCR punk.
Everything's VCR punk if you try hard enough, and it was made before 2000.
That's true. But this is where I think it comes all done. I think there's things that didn't work. The dialogue, I think, it was written by Jonathan Nolan. Apparently, the script, it went through some rewrites, so maybe that was a thing. One review put it that it's kind of like some of the dialogue was like cribbed from a Hallmark green card. Like Cooper's father saying like how every day was Christmas with the internet. It's like, why would that conversation really happen in real life? B, why is this in this movie? You know what I'm kind of saying?
Yeah, I get what you're getting at.
And then there's things like Cooper, you a-hole, which not because it's cursing, but just because like, why would two professionals suddenly insult one another in a critical time? I'm just not convinced that would happen.
I'm convinced that would happen. People insult each other all the time for the dumbest reasons.
But I don't think it was consistently throughout the film to be like, yeah, this is her personality, this is his personality, you know.
Butthead. No, I disagree because I think that makes a three-dimensional character because characters can behave consistently to a point, but characters are their most interesting when they break their own consistency.
Yeah, unpredictability is true too, but my point is just like I think the dialogue fell short, and that like it's just looking back on it, it's just more glaring. The more
you do have a point in 2001. The dialogue is a little bit. the auditory storytelling could be better.
Yeah, it's usually science fiction films that if it's not there, this is one of the reasons why I love Brazil, by the way, because it knows that it's going to be old one day, and it tries to be retrofuturistic. I mean, like, you can tell it was made in the 80s, but other than that, it's like, yeah. And that being said, I kind of think that even then Interstellar, like, made certain things, like, try to sort of be timeless. Like, they didn't have holograms really anywhere in the movie that I can remember, especially not on the endurance. Because like everything's like a touch screen, like a touchscreen keypad, which I really never said because your fingers would go through it, and that would hurt, like, for my fingers just having propped up on nothing after a while. But that wasn't in there.
Yeah, like, I think we do need to be practical about, like, the fact that, you know, a lot of people still prefer mechanical keyboards and stuff. Like, that's unlikely to change in the future.
Yeah.
Like there's a reason people are still buying desktop computers.
Oh, yeah. I probably always would. It would be like a mark of my generation forever, so, but I would.
All right, so...
And my last thing is that I just think it was a bit cheery of an ending. Like, I know it kind of had to happen, like, with, like, the beings, like, manipulating things from the beginning, but I don't know, like, maybe that's just, like, me being, like, a 21st century, like, everything has to be depressing and stuff, but I don't know. Did you feel that, too?
That it was kind of an over...
It was a little bit too easy, I guess is what I'm saying.
Yeah, okay, yeah. The ending felt like a Deus Ex Machina.
It was supposed to be, but I don't think...
Well, right. There is a place for it, I guess.
Well, what made me think of it was, like, have you ever seen the movie Mongolia? The 1999 film by Paul... whatever.
Maybe. What's it about?
Well, and it's kind of like an anthology film. It's hard to explain, but at the end they had, just for no explaining reason, just raining frogs in New York, and it kind of almost reminded me more of that.
Oh yeah,
like,
no, we didn't watch that. I'm sorry. For a second, for a second you said the name, and I thought we watched it together, and I realized we didn't.
No, never did. But
it's all the single name country movies.
Magnolia is not a country. Mongolia is.
Oh, I thought you said Mongolia.
I said Magnolia.
I thought you said Mongolia. Now I'm confused. We're back.
Anyway, but I think it's like one of those moments in film when, like, you can just have the unexplained and get away with it. But I don't know if it. That's basically what it can come up to. But I feel like, maybe it didn't meet that standard. Like, it didn't represent life's unpredictability. It did just represent being in a fictional work where you have to have a happy Hollywood ending.
True. But
because he's played by Matthew McConaughey, you can't kill him.
Of course, but then again, if you arrive at an irredeemable ending, I think you've ultimately failed as a storyteller, because there is something. There's no reason to give the audience a bad ending when you can give them the good ending and still have them believe it. It becomes a problem when you go for an unrealistically good ending. Yeah. But I think that part of writing is trying to achieve the best of all possible endings.
Maybe. But anyway, I lied. The very last thing is I don't think
lying is bad.
The causal loop, or however it's pronounced, like, really wouldn't work unless Cooper basically got spit out into another universe, like a parallel universe at the very end, because it's like the law of non-contradiction is a thing. You know, you can't really, like, create your own closed system. I don't know. But I don't know. I'm going to leave it up to the physicists. So
leave it up to the smart people. All right. So as for me, the book I kind of chose to be my sort of both my paradigm and my bottom denominator for, I'm going to make this quick because I think I've already talked about it on the podcast, is Robot City.
No, I don't think you've ever talked about that.
I haven't talked about this on the podcast? I feel like I have, but it was written by two of Isaac Asimov's students. Basically, before he died, he left them a writing challenge and asked them to write two halves of a story set in a universe that followed his rules, basically.
His laws of robotics, or what?
Yeah, his laws of robotics and, other standards of Asimov. Because I'd say I do rather like Asimov. I have read what he's written, and he's impressive. Can be incredibly boring sometimes. I mean, downright dreadfully boring.
It's the systematizer mind again.
Yes, but there's also some really good stuff that he gets to. It's sort of like how the Foundation series doesn't make any sense until you're halfway through the second book, and then it all makes sense. Kind of.
Why is he writing this kind of what?
Not just like how like the story itself doesn't make any sense until the second book.
Okay.
Like the first book is just like a what? It's just a giant wait, what? But for me, it was sort of this robot city, because this also showed me like how like really good science fiction could be with like the first half of it, written by the one guy. Cause it was solid. It was very interesting, and the second half, which kind of undid a lot of the good things, it kind of like it was an interesting male lead with an alien, with a friendly alien who was really interesting. And they were kind of living on a starship, and they wanted to escape.
Was this more space opera, or is this more like science fiction of ideas?
The conceptual part was more inside the second part. The storytelling was mostly in the first part. And the problem is they didn't connect well together. Like, the story was good, but it was failed to be carried over in conception. In, like, the conception that would kind of drive it.
So it's almost like the two authors had two different agendas.
They wanted to write two different novels. The first one probably would have been a good story, but not necessarily anything groundbreaking. The
first part.
Yeah, the first part. The second one took some really interesting ideas, but made a complete mess of the story. It was they turned all of a sudden the alien companion gets hostile for no apparent reason, because the introduction of another female character who is obnoxious. She's annoying, she is domineering, controlling, manipulative, cruel, uncaring.
Anti-Mary Sue.
Yes, except she's always kind of presented positively, which is weird, because like, I mean, I ended up loathing her by the end of the book. The male hero, it ends up kind of just being like this. He spends the rest of the book kind of running around emasculated and entirely confused about what his purpose is. Like, the first part is like, okay, I survived. I made an ally. I gotta figure out what to do next. Like, I'm like, I can get out of this. And then it gets down to like, this guy's like, I'm running around this city that's like building itself into oblivion, being told what to do by robots and my jerky girlfriend. That's the entire second half of the book, and it's
so why is this
unbearable.
Your favorite science fiction media piece of all time?
Because I think it shows what science fiction needs to be. It needs to be both. Because when you separate story from conception, you separate story from purpose, one suffers and they ultimately fail as a work of fiction. They need to work in tandem together to be a successful work of fiction. This book shows the two elements operating successfully independently, but only at brief times when they work together does it actually become a really super engaging and like mind-testing book.
So by being a failure, it helps you see.
Yes.
How it could work.
Yes, because the best way to figure success is from failure. Because if you keep trying to emulate success, you will obsess about being successful rather than doing things well. You'll obsess about the results over the cause.
It sounds like you're speaking more to yourself than anything, but that is a good point.
I don't necessarily think that's just to myself. I think that's kind of a standard principle of operating that I think...
Well, that's true.
All right. So, if you're good and I'm good, would you like to move on to our question and answer time?
Yeah, sure.
Groovy cakes. You led off last time, so I'll lead off this time. Because I think you led off. Did you lead off last time?
Yeah. It doesn't matter.
Okay, I'll go. So first of all, this is going to sound stupid, but I actually find this a very interesting way to start conversations with people. What's your favorite way to eat cooked potatoes?
I don't eat them.
Wait, what?
I kind of had like a thing against potatoes as a kid. I betray my Irish heritage.
Oh, I forgot. I forgot that you have a thing against potatoes. I'm a terrible friend. I entirely forgot. I haven't seen you for a long time. I haven't seen you in the context of potato. Wait, you eat French fries though, don't you?
Yeah, I meant like mashed potatoes and like baked
Oh,
potatoes because you asked about baked potatoes.
well, I said cooked potatoes. I count French fries as cooked potatoes.
Oh, yeah. I guess just fries, which says a lot about me.
Okay, fair enough. Your question, sir.
Okay, well, I got about a couple, so I'll randomize them as I always do. Hopefully, I'll get a good one. Oh, this is a long one.
Okay.
Do you like more detail-oriented? Maybe this is worded wrong, but I'll try to sum up if you don't understand. Do you like more detail-oriented fantasy like King of Elfland's Daughter, or world-building oriented fantasy like Lord of the Rings? Like, do you like Lord of the Rings or King of Elfland's Daughter better, and why?
That's like asking me, do I prefer something that is more imaginative or something that is more built from tradition? I'm writing a paper about how the King of Elfland's Daughter is an intensely Irish fairy tale, even though he supposedly sets it in England.
Yeah, he kind of does. Yeah.
I think he,
But you're writing about King of Elfland's
I
Daughter.
am actually
Oh,
for
what's the
a
subject?
term paper. It's talking about the connection between the Romantic movement, Irish nationalism, and the King of Elfland's Daughter.
Oh, perfect novel. It came out in just around the right
Yes,
time of
and
Irish independence.
right, and it participates quite a bit in the Romantic tradition. And Romanticism is inherently nationalist, especially in
I was
its
shaking my head. Yes.
because it starts with the English Romantic movement, which was against continental Europe. It was the attempt to reclaim their national literary identity.
And this is the Irish equivalent.
Right, and I think the Irish equivalent kind of comes with Yeats and Lady Gregory and Lord Dunsany, and
And Joyce. Well, Joyce did Ulysses, right?
yes, but I would not put Joyce as a romanticist at all.
Yeah, because Joyce, he wrote the novel in Paris anyway, so I don't know if he would. I don't
Yeah,
know.
I would have to do a lot more research, but I would even maybe perhaps argue that The King of Elfland's Daughter is a much more Irish novel based on the quality of its text and its method of storytelling than uh, many of Joyce's works, because they are written in a continental European style by somebody in, at least partially, sometimes in continental Europe.
Yeah, Ulysses, I think, was kind of trying to be more experimental, like with like every chapter. For I understand, like if you want, Finnegan's Wake might have been was trying to be more dreamlike, like
Yes,
King of
but
Elfland's Daughter.
yeah,
So
the dream speak of that actually that the idea of dream speak itself is actually an Irish tradition, an Irish fairy tale tradition.
really, I found
The
that very interesting.
like the concept of it.
I
It's
like that. I really am attracted to that kind of fiction, including
yeah,
the.
it's very interesting. So
What are you going to say? Like, what just had to do with the
I'm
paper?
deeply attracted to both. I feel like a world has to build. I feel like a novel has to build a believable world for you to live in, and I feel like Tolkien builds the more complete world to live in, whereas Dunsany's is feels closer to our current reality. One is more accessible from your armchair, but the other is more livable in your mind, and I think it
Yeah,
depends on what you're trying to say.
interesting. So, what does your paper say? Out of curiosity.
Oh, I'm just arguing that Dunsany's kind of gotten snubbed, like he's been left out of a lot of history texts by like people talking about who were by authors at the time, and I'm saying he deserves to be both considered in the romantic and like the modern romantic tradition and in the Irish tradition because he wrote like his most popular book has like glaringly obvious elements of both.
Oh yeah, definitely. Just out of curiosity, does he have a bust at that like big Irish library in Dublin or whatever with all the other authors?
I do not know.
I've tried to Google it and I can't find it. That's kind of terrible if you think about it. You know?
Yeah. All right, for you.
Yes.
What movie deserves to have a television series?
The Vor, probably the Vor, just because it's such a long and detailed book series. But I think that you would have a pretty big budget to get it right.
Okay.
And maybe Gorman Goss, just because I love it. But
That'd be
had to
a
pick one.
slow series.
Yes, it would.
Be artsy, but it'd be slow.
The Vor, I think, would be better.
I have
But-
yet to read that.
I have a copy, but I'm going through it slowly.
Yeah,
Very interesting.
I hear you on that.
It's quite romantic in its own way. Now, like a lot of man versus nature, seeing nature, all nature is beautiful, not just the kind that we like or we consider appropriate in our Victorian standards, and the hypocrisy of Victorian, supposedly perfect European life.
True, but I would disagree using the philosophical arguments of aesthetics, in that there are some things that aren't beautiful.
Well, I was just gonna say you're going to read the novel when you get to it.
I will have to read the novel at some point.
But a lot of romanticism and man versus nature themes going on there.
True. All right. And your question for me, sir.
Okay, I only got like 2, but name a work of fiction that would be fun to parody.
Work of fiction that'd be fun to parody. Oh, there are so many. Oh golly, what would be a fun one to?
Disgaea. No.
Me.
Disgaea is already a parody, though.
Yeah, Disgaea is a parody of a parody.
What's a parody of? I mean, in general.
It's a parody of like.
Dragon Quest?
What was it?
Dragon Quest or what?
No, it's like a parody of like dark anime themed games, which are often kind of like just like absurd, like accidental parodies of like actual like somewhat serious RPGs. Like I don't know where I'm going with that. That was me getting way too deep and probably wrong. A work of fiction that would be fun to parody. I'm thinking you could do... It's been done, though. I'm thinking you could do the Aeneid. The Aeneid would be kind of fun to parody.
I don't think anyone would get that if we tried it.
True.
So.
The Odyssey... I mean, but Oh Brother, Where Art Thou was the parody of the Odyssey, essentially.
Yeah, that's true. You'd have to basically disguise it for the layman, though.
True, but I think a lot of people got it, though.
Well, you said you parodied already.
Yeah. I first thought of the Odyssey, then I realized the Aeneid is the story I was actually thinking of.
Oh.
I don't know. I'm trying to think of anything else that could be parodied. Dante's Inferno has been parodied so many times, parodied and copied so many times by so many different books. I think that's kind of, we should let that exist for what it is. We should let that exist as a masterpiece for what it is. So I think I'm gonna stick with it. I'm thinking the Aeneid could be fun. I'm sure someone's already done it, but I think Game of Thrones deserves a parody.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Because it takes itself so freaking seriously. If you ever get to books that were the biggest disappointments, we should definitely talk about that sometime, and I would definitely include Game of Thrones. It's one of the biggest.
And I would put in the Wheel of Time just to offend all my friends here. No.
I don't know. I have yet to read the Wheel of Time.
Wheel of Time had promise though. Shannara, you're right.
Shannara is a parody. We can't do a parody of a parody.
It was a parody that was trying to make money off Lord of the Rings in the 70s.
D&D exploitation. What? Alrighty, so I think that's going to do it for you and me tonight.
Yeah.
So, with a kind adieu and a cheery wave, we float off into the planetary void in the dark between the stars, saluting you, hoping that alien mother doesn't wake up and eat all of our androids so nobody can fly the ship home. We crash down on a planet with Charles Dance and even more aliens on it. That was a really long Aliens reference. And also Aliens 3, the one we don't talk about. Well, anyway, have a good night. I'm Andrew.
And Matthew.
That was a big old delay. He forgot who he was. You know what? Can we ever stop learning who we are?
No, stop the episode. It's going to go on